So let's say you found a skeleton. How would you tell it's a dinosaur? You personally, how would you decide?
Well, interesting question. I don't know. I'd have to do some research on that.
Hey there, YouTube, the Dapper Dinosaur here. We are back to talk about the nonsense spewed by one Thomas Kindell. When last we left off, he was lying about what was found in the fossil record, and most of the lies were just repeated lies from Carl Werner, a medical doctor who went around lying to paleontologists, by his own admission, for years in order to write a couple of books misrepresenting paleontology and making up a crazy conspiracy theory in which museums hide and keep secret non-dinosaur fauna from the Mesozoic for some reason. He then went on a 20-minute rant about how the Bible teaches young Earth creationism, to which I say, okay, if he wants to make the Bible look stupid, it's not really my job to stop him. Well, now that rant that we skipped about the Bible is over, let's get back to the science topics.
Okay, now I'm going to quote some evolutionists here to corroborate what I've said already.
Well, this bodes ill. I don't care what some guy said. I care about the evidence. Scientists say all sorts of things, but the data is what determines what conclusions are to be reached in science. When Pons and Fleischmann said that they had invented cold fusion, the data didn't back them up, even though they said all sorts of cool things about cold fusion. And you could easily make a case that cold fusion is both really cool and very effective just by quoting them. But they were wrong. Science isn't about personalities, or at least it's not supposed to be, even if sometimes it fails to live up to that ideal. But fundamentally, personalities fall out of favor, and what remains is the data. Thomas should tell us about the data.
Dr. Derek Ager, former head of the British Geological Association, in his book New Catastrophism, he said nowhere in the world is the record, or even part of it, anywhere near complete.
Yeah, this isn't news. Darwin lamented the incompleteness of the fossil record. Near as I can tell, no one has ever argued that the fossil record comes even close to preserving all species that have ever existed, or that we are anywhere close to finding all the organisms that are currently preserved in it. Yet despite this, we have a plethora of transitional forms, and the occurrence of groups of organisms couples well with things like estimates of divergence times from genetic studies, thereby corroborating the predictions of evolution by making them via separate lines of data that would only be related in this way if evolution were true.
So when I said this geological column does not exist in its complete form like this anywhere in the world, and indeed if it did, it wouldn't fit in the crust of the earth, he's saying the same thing. It has to be put together on paper.
Yeah, that's how scientific models work. They're not the real thing. They're constructs that are simplified that help you figure out the real thing. Yet again, we have a creationist complaining that science is doing science things, when he would rather that science just not be done at all.
It does not exist in its complete form anywhere in real field geology.
Yep.
And when you go to the real physical equator, it's not a really big red line across the whole Earth. But that doesn't make Earth fake.
Also, I quote here Carl Dunbar in his book Historical Geology, the second edition, and he admits that no single area contains a record of all geological time.
Yeah, for the contrary to be true, that area would have to have never weathered in its entire history. That seems impossible. So of course no location has a deposition for a continuous 4.5 or so billion years. That's all that means.
We need only discover and correlate enough of the what? The scattered fragments. That's the way it is. It's very mixed up.
No, that's the point. It's actually not mixed up despite being fragmented. Despite the fragmentation, the layers always come in a consistent order once the original order of deposition is established, which is established independently of applying the model of the geologic column. Cambrian layers are never deposited on top of Jurassic layers, and you never dig down through Silurian rock, only to end up finding that it was deposited directly on top of Miocene rock.
But using evolution as the key to the puzzle, they can put it on paper to look exactly the way they want to.
Nope, the stratigraphic column was developed before the theory of evolution, and it was developed by creationists. The very fact that Darwin was able to talk about different rock systems by name is because this model had already been worked out by the time he set off on the Beagle.
All the contradictory evidence is neatly censored.
That's a mighty big claim, especially since so far the only argument in favor of it that we've been given is that museums don't display tiny mammals as often as big dinosaurs. I feel like that is insufficient evidence to confirm the existence of a vast conspiracy among museum curators and directors, geologists, paleontologists, nuclear physics, astronomers, biologists, and more. And yes, a conspiracy to hide the evidence for young Earth creationism or against the conclusions of science that it opposes would have to extend to all of those people and more.
It's labeled anomalous or invalid because obviously that contradicts evolution. It can't be true because that's just not conceivable.
Wow, that sounds like a dastardly thing to do. I wonder if we're about to get any actual examples that we can look into.
And so they built it up from a scattered jigsaw puzzle using evolution as the key to the puzzle.
Okay, I really want to emphasize the degree to which Tom is getting this backwards. Stratigraphy got its start with Steno's laws. Nicholas Steno was a Danish naturalist working in the 1600s. He came up with principles still used today, such as the law of superposition, the law of original horizontality, the law of cross-cutting relationships, and the law of lateral continuity. Granted, he didn't work out the full model we have now, but that was the start of the modeling of the Earth by stratigraphy. By contrast, the publication date for the first edition of Origin of Species was 1859, some 200 years after stratigraphy was established as a field of study. Unless Kindell wants us to believe that some guy from Denmark was actually gifted with prescience and was the original Kwisatz Haderach or something, stratigraphy was worked out long before the theory of evolution was, even though both have undergone updates since then.
And of course, it always agrees with evolution because of that.
And there's the reason for the lie. Stratigraphy strongly supports the ancient age of the Earth and the predictions of the theory of evolution. The fact that they were developed independently means that their cross-confirmation increases the confidence we can have in both. So Kindell has to make up a way in which they are circularly dependent, and he does this by pretending that stratigraphy was based on evolution, which is impossible.
Dunbar again, he says, for more than 100 years, the geologists of all countries have been cooperating in this endeavor, and the total thickness of the stratified rocks now recognized would exceed 500,000 feet or some 95 miles if the beds were directly superposed. That's where I said it's nearly 100 miles deep because of how they hypothetically put the thickest layers of fossils on top of each other to form this chart called the geological column.
Ah, so this is where he got the stupid and wrong talking point that no place could have an example of all the strata because it would be too thick. Of course, the actual currently existing stratified rock would reach absurd depths if stacked together in a single column, but that doesn't mean that any possible column with every layer would be that thick. In reality, the actual rocks of the Earth aren't all as thin as they possibly could be, but in hypothetical land, they all can be. It seems that Kindell really is stupid, not just dishonest.
Now then, in the textbook Geology by the evolutionist geologists Putnam and Bassett, they outright admit this thing is based on circular reasoning, a textbook fallacy of logic, and is therefore invalid to prove anything.
Well, first, science isn't in the business of proving things, but second, no, that is not them admitting that stratigraphy is circular, because it's not. Relative dating does not solely depend on fossils, but once relative dating is established, it can be used to work out the locations of fossils in different sites independently. And then once it is noticed that the flora and fauna of different fossiliferous strata are correlated across the globe, then the flora and fauna can be used to help date subsequent areas. Then, of course, we get to the ellipsis. And in a quote from a book that seems to be from the 1970s based on my research, and that I have no easy way to get a copy of. But given the long history of dishonest quote mining from creationists, you'll have to forgive me if I don't take at face value that these bits from the book actually go together.
He says that the early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Now stop right there. The Bible says that all animals, big and small...
No one gives a f***. Geology is about what's in the rocks, not what's in a book.
So how do we look at a dead thing in rock and know that it's an early organism as opposed to one that's an older organism?
Stratigraphy and radiometric dating. Evolutionary biology is actually superfluous to this. That's why progressive creation was a thing. It accepts the relative and even absolute dating, but denies the evolution part, because it turns out that you don't need evolution to determine the age of rocks, whether in relative or absolute terms. And we know because historically that used to be a very common stance in science.
We didn't see them, we didn't observe them getting fossilized. It's an interpretation based on a preconceived idea.
Technically, that's not wrong. We have to assume that the universe operates according to the same sets of rules and principles now that it will in the future and did in the past. That's the fundamental assumption of science, the temporal invariability of the way the universe operates. Mr. Kindell is welcome to reject the idea of empiricism if he'd like, but that is the same as rejecting the validity of the very idea of science, which is all about empiricism. Really, I suspect that that is what Kindell actually wants to do, but he knows that science is so popular, he can't really call for people to ignore it altogether.
The idea being That if it's a simpler organism, it must have evolved sooner and is therefore older. If it's a more advanced organism, it evolved later and is therefore more recent.
Nope, simpler and advanced are not opposed to each other in evolutionary biology. And that's part of the reason that biologists have started to drop the word advanced in favor of the word derived. In evolutionary biology, there are two pairs of words that mean the same thing. The older pair is primitive and advanced, and the other pair is basal and derived. Primitive and basal mean the same thing, as do advanced and derived, but neither set of words means simple or complex. An example of a highly derived or advanced animal that is radically simple is mixozoans. These are cnidarians that typically only have a handful of cells and in some species don't even have mitochondria. The basal form of mixozoan would have been much more complex, resembling a modern coral or jellyfish. Basal or primitive means the ancestral condition, and advanced or derived means the later evolved condition. You can't simply look at an organism in isolation and determine if it is basal or derived. You need to look at it in the context of its ancestors' potential descendants and contemporaneous relatives. Now, once you've done that, if you have a rock on which no other stratigraphy has been done, nor has it been dated absolutely, you can use the basal or derived characteristics of an organism to give a guess as to how old the rock is, but that's never going to be enough to confirm it, and you should always try to use more reliable techniques. For one thing, basal forms of organisms can persist long after their relatives have become highly derived.
So they're using the assumption that evolution took place, even though they can't prove evolution is even true, to interpret how they look at fossils and where they put them in the geological column.
Evolution is the universally accepted consensus among biologists. No one has ever successfully challenged it, and there is no counter-evidence. The only reasonable thing to do is to accept it as true and go from there. Evolution is on a similarly firm foundation of evidence as the globe shape of the Earth, the idea that physical matter is made up of atoms and molecules, or the fact that gravity is real and makes matter move towards other matter. Kindell is welcome to not believe these things, but a biologist assuming that evolution is true is no more ridiculous than an engineer assuming that the theory of universal gravitation is true when he's designing a bridge, or a chemist assuming that atomic theory is true when coming up with a new chemical reaction, or a doctor assuming the germ theory of disease is true when prescribing antibiotics to treat an infection. Evolution is the firm and so far unshaken conclusion of centuries of scientific study and advancement. We don't need to repeat all that work in order to simply take it as true in future work. That is how science builds upon itself, by accepting previous work so long as new data do not challenge the conclusions of that previous work, and then building from there. We don't ask that someone designing a new car actually go re-verify all of Newton's work. We don't need NASA to rederive Einstein's equation every time they need to design an interplanetary antenna, etc. Scientists routinely assume that the work of earlier scientists is sound until they find something that indicates it is not. I once again have to point out that for a group of people who claim to love science, young Earth creationists really actually hate science to its core. They hate the very process of science. They want science to stop. Young Earth creationism is one of the most retrograde forces that is imaginable in the field of science. They're right up there with the Taliban banning weather forecasts because only Allah knows the future, and predicting the weather in a week's time is blasphemy.
Fossils are nothing but dead things in rock.
Not quite. That describes body fossils, but not ichnofossils. Those are fossils too. Things like coprolites, fossil burrows, fossil trackways, etc. are just as much fossils as the skeleton of a dinosaur is.
And if you pick up this dead thing in rock and hold it up to your ear, it can't talk to you and say, I'm of the Cambrian age and I'm 500 million years old.
Which probably explains why you never read about a paleontologist listening to a fossil for audible clues when it comes to dating fossils. But then you also can't pick up a fossil and ask it how much it weighs. You have to use a tool to measure that, which, we can and do, and we use other tools to measure its age.
They have to be interpreted, and they're interpreted based on their preconceived idea that evolution is true in the first place.
This is getting a bit exhausting. Of course they need to be interpreted, but that interpretation isn't related to their age, but rather their placement in the tree of life, which is a separate question. But the fact that the age corresponds to predictions from evolution isn't an example of circular reasoning, but rather that evolution continues to make accurate predictions about what life was like in the past in instances where we haven't actually found fossils yet. What's actually going on is that evolution is making predictions, and since evolution has been pretty damn good at that, people tend to accept the predictions at first, but then later, when they use actual independent dating techniques and the techniques give ages that line up with evolution, even though they in no way depend on evolution, That strengthens the case for evolution, and that keeps happening every single day.
So that's why they always end up in the order. No matter what mixed up order you find them in, it doesn't matter. They go in the order evolution says they ought to be, because they use the assumption that evolution is true and has taken place to put them in the right order on the chart.
And so far, all we've been given to think that that's true is that Carl Werner doesn't know how to identify birds. Not exactly a compelling case.
And fatal contradictions are simply ignored.
I'm not going to ignore a fatal contradiction. I'd love to be proven wrong, to be convinced that there's definitely a God I can worship for an eternal blissful existence. The problem is, though, that when I go looking for such things, they always end up being creationists, either being profoundly stupid or profoundly dishonest, or both. And Kindell isn't exactly offering up a counterexample.
They call them stratigraphic leaks or reworked specimens or eroded and redeposited specimens, all kinds of hypotheses to explain why they should not be there.
You know, reworked deposits are a real thing. I would love to know of an example of one where Kindell thinks that the evidence of reworking is insufficient, and we have a truly anomalous fossil. I feel like at this rate, though, he's established the pattern that he'll just say things and then offer no actual examples so people can look into it for themselves. His argument just comes down to trust me, bro. But the problem is that I've looked into too many creationist arguments, and trusting a creationist to tell the truth is like trusting a scorpion riding on your back across a pond to not sting you. Scorpions sting. It's their nature. Creationists lie. It's their nature. And the ones that don't tend not to stay creationists for very long.
Even though the physical evidence often is not there at all for that, but they have to have some convenient way to say it doesn't really have significance.
So the claim is that scientists are just claiming reworking, even though in most cases there is no evidence of that. The thing is that every time I've seen a scientist claim that some rocks have been reworked, they've provided evidence. So where are these unevidenced claims of reworking? Like, do we actually have any? This seems like it's Kindell's MO. Just find an explanation for what he thinks is otherwise anomalous data, given the current scientific paradigm, and then contend that there isn't actually any positive evidence for that explanation, even though there actually is. And he isn't inclined to actually give us any examples of the explanation being invoked without such evidence. He just assures us that it is. But I don't trust Thomas Kindell, so why should I take his word for it?
And usually they do it just by not talking about it. They don't put it, they don't mention it in the fine print, and most people don't even know there are contradictions.
Then how does Kindell know about it? Like, let's say that someone found a modern human in, say, bed 2 of the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania, which would be hard to explain, as that is before modern humans seem to have evolved. This seems like a clear example of the kind of thing he's going on about. So what would the scientific community do? Fail to report on the find? Well, no, and I know because I'm referring to OH1, an anatomically modern human found in bed 2 of the Olduvai Gorge in Tanzania. So let's dive into that find and see if the handling of it corresponds to what Kindell is telling us. It was unearthed in 1913, as I have said, in bed 2. The Olduvai Gorge is split up into bedding layers, each of which has different types of rock, as well as somewhat different fossils. The numbers start with 1 as the lowest and go up from there, so it was found in the second lowest layer. So was it hidden? Nope, it was published in books, and it is still published on in the literature. In fact, the main source I'm relying on for it was published in 2017, 106 years after it was initially dug up. Now, it is understood as a specimen in reworked rock, meaning that it actually probably is from the time of bed 4 or later. Was this decision arrived at arbitrarily in order to save evolution? Nope, it turns out that the sediment around OH1 was consistent with a mix of beds 2, 3, and 4, but not with in situ preservation in bed 2, like the Homo habilis remains found nearby. Since it's impossible to be buried in sediment that hasn't been laid down yet, the only explanation is reworking. Also, to corroborate this, the skeleton has been carbon dated to around 16,000 years old, give or take about 1,000 years. This is consistent with bed 4 and not bed 2, so yeah, that's what actually happens in the literature. And Kindell doesn't actually have a counterexample. He just has the claim of a vast conspiracy.
And that's like it is with the fake news.
Fake news.
You know, if you don't hear what's going on, you don't know about it.
I really wish Tommy here would take Cheeto Hitler's cock out of his mouth and give us an actual example, rather than just tossing around accusations at the scientific community at large.
And that works very conveniently.
Yes, in fact, tossing out unsubstantiated conspiracy theories is a very convenient shield for when you don't have a single bit of evidence, but you want to believe anyway.
Okay, so the early form of an organism was clearly older than rocks containing later forms. Furthermore, all rocks that had the early form no matter how far apart those rocks were geographically, would have to be the same age. Would you correlate them from different continents based on the stage of evolution, something that's never been proven?
First, science doesn't prove things. Second, evolution is no longer in the business of being demonstrated. That happened about 100 years ago. If Tommy here wants to overturn it, whining that it's not proven isn't going to help. The globe shape of the Earth isn't proven in the sense of mathematical proof either, but it's still not being investigated as if it's one possibility among many. It's the only possibility. Evolution is in the same boat. The time when it was being questioned is long gone. Every single line of evidence is in line with evolution, and most of them exclusively so. The fossil record, radiometric dating, taxonomy, taphonomy, astronomy, genetics, morphology, all line up to tell the same story, that of an ancient Earth on which life has been evolving for billions of years.
Notice he admits, in this way, our geologic timetable came into being. Notice the admission, without the theory of evolution and the interdisciplinary science of paleontology, it could not exist.
I mean, he's flatly wrong, but whatever. Argument from Quote Mine isn't going away anytime soon.
In other words, you can't build this geological column. It can't exist even on paper unless you assume the theory of evolution is true in the first place.
Weird then how it was actually built before that, although it is true that later refinements are indeed aided by evolutionary biology. But it remains a simple fact of history that the stratigraphic column in its basic form was indeed created primarily by Christian creationists who believed in special creation.
The problem is they use this geological column as the primary proof. After those three strikes, this is their last bastion of defense, the fossil-strata relationship, and so they use it as the primary proof that evolution is true, and yet the column can't exist unless you assume the theory is true.
No, the primary proof is the genetics, because that's the thing that evolution is about, change in the genome over time. Paleontology provides support and corroboration, but we could erase all data and theory about geology and paleontology, and evolution would remain one of the best supported ideas in all of science, and the unifying theory of biology.
So if you have to assume the theory to prove that it's true, then that's classic circular reasoning, and is therefore logically invalid.
Kind of like how you know that the story of Noah's Ark is true, because it's in the Bible, and you know the Bible is true because it says so.
They simply can't be that wrong and still have any credibility.
Yep, that sums up young Earth creationism and most other forms of pseudoscience.
Now, here we have Ronald West, paleontologist at Kansas State University. He probably got excommunicated from the evolutionary fraternity for even admitting this in writing.
Ronald West's most recent work I can find is Dependent and Independent Data in Paleontology, Tools for the Sedimentary Modeler, published April 2024 in the Kansas Geological Survey. I see him with 53 published works, including from 2024, 2018, multiple papers from 2017, and so on. The work Kindell is citing is from 1968. Seems like he hasn't been excommunicated.
But he admits that contrary to what most scientists write, the fossil record does not support the Darwinian theory of evolution. Because it is this theory. There are several. There are different theories of evolution, but it's the Darwinian theory that is used to interpret the fossil record.
First, Ronald West, along with all these other people Kindell is quote mining, is not a prophet. Science does not work that way. Scientists are often wrong, and West was wrong when he wrote this. The easiest way to tell is that evolutionary theory predicts future fossil finds. The most famous example is Tiktaalik. Neil Shubin at FAM were trying to find a fossil of the transition from more basal stegocephalian fish like Eusthenopteron, and later stem tetrapods like Ichthyostega. They looked through the geology literature and the evolutionary biology literature to determine the time and environment when such a creature likely lived, then looked for where the right type of rock from the right point in time was exposed, and found that it was in Ellesmere Island in northern Canada. There they found exactly what they were looking for and named it Tiktaalik. But the thing is, this is not really exceptional. Paleontology digs are generally funded based on expected finds, and the way that people can successfully predict where they will find the kind of new fossil they're looking for is a combination of stratigraphy and evolutionary theory. Every single fossil that was predicted beforehand, which is most of the at least vertebrate new species found in the fossil record now, is itself evidence that the fossil record in fact supports evolution. And even without the stratigraphy, the fact is that transitional forms are found all the time that are predicted by evolution, further supporting the theory.
And a competing theory, at least theoretically, as a hypothesis, is creation in the flood.
Which new find was predicted on the basis of young Earth flood geology? Seems like it's none. Is it none?
It has a right to compete to explain the evidence.
Absolutely, flood geology has the right to compete. The problem is that it did. It already lost. Just like the miasma theory of disease, the phlogiston theory of fire, and the undulating theory of light have the right to compete, and did in fact compete. And all of them lost. Disease isn't caused by noxious odors. Fire isn't made of a special substance called phlogiston, which is contained by flammable substances, only to be released when they burn. And light doesn't propagate by moving a physical medium that suffuses the universe. Similarly, there never was a global deluge. These ideas weren't rejected because people wanted to live in sin. They were rejected because they were tested and found to be false.
They don't use that to interpret the fossil record. They use the assumption Darwinism is true.
Well, not Darwinism, but modern evolutionary theory, and yes, they do. Because when they do, they get results, whether it be new fossils of the kind predicted, or new sources of oil. When flood geology is used, no results are obtained, which can be seen by the fact that flood geologists are out there making bank for oil companies, or discovering new dinosaurs on the regular, unlike conventional geologists and paleontologists. And the thing is, no one is stopping creationists from doing paleontology or geology. In fact, Loma Linda sends out field paleontology teams fairly regularly, and they're a young Earth creationist school.
So he says, which we use to interpret the fossil record. By doing so, we are guilty of circular reasoning, if we then say the fossil record supports this theory.
Wow.
A scientist was wrong in the 60s? Whoop-de-doo.
So using the assumption that evolution is true to put the fossils in the order that they want them in, even though we don't find them in that order.
He keeps saying that without giving a single actual example. It's almost like he's making it up.
Is classic circular reasoning and is admitted by some evolutionist authorities.
Well, good thing we now have radiometric dating and predictions based on evolutionary biology that actually mean this isn't circular at all, and is strictly empirical and statistical evidence in favor of common ancestry and changing morphology of organisms through time.
So, Encyclopedia Britannica is a rapidly evolutionary encyclopedia, but every now and then a jewel of truth kind of slips past the editors, and I think this is one of those nuggets of truth.
Ah, yes, pathologizing the acceptance of the evidence for well-supported principles in science. Well, you too, Tom.
Here they say the end product of correlation, using index fossils, stage of evolution fossils, to build up this column, is what? A fact of science? No, a mental abstraction.
Yes, that's what a model is, you dunderheaded devious dolt. It's an abstraction you can hold in your mind or in some kind of math that shows you how to predict future data and explains past data. The whole point of models is that they don't have to exist physically, but they still predict physical phenomena well enough to be useful, despite simplifications. Yet again, we have a creationist showing how much they actually loathe science.
Called the geological column. We don't have to be afraid of a piece of paper that doesn't exist in field geology, that can't even be put together.
Yet he manifestly is, and he should be, because the data on the ground say that basically his entire view of world history isn't just wrong, it's physically impossible.
Unless by their own admission they indulge in the logical fallacy of circular reasoning. It's just a mental abstraction based on their assumption that they assume what they want to believe, and that's the only assumption they're going to go with.
Yup, and it just so happens to be the assumption that gets results when results matter.
And no evidence to the contrary is allowed to see the light of day.
Kind of like how Superman isn't allowed to see the light of day. Not because anyone is trying to suppress him or anything, but because, he doesn't exist. Of course, if Tom disagrees and thinks that counter-evidence does exist, he could have actually just cited an example of it. And no, positing a vast conspiracy doesn't actually help with that.
Fatally destroying this whole concept of different ages of geology and life evolving over many millions of years into different stages of more and more complex forms is the evidence we now have of soft, flexible tissue, largely intact cell structures, and largely intact proteins.
Oh goody, here we go.
In dinosaurs, which are supposed to be at a minimum 65 million to 240 million years old.
Only if we exclude birds, but sure, whatever.
And even some creatures from the so-called Cambrian age, in excess of 500 million years old, which is more than half a billion years old.
So I just went hunting for examples of preserved soft tissue from the Cambrian, and all I can find is permineralized soft tissue, which is not what he's talking about. He's talking about preserved biomolecules that retain some of the mechanical properties of the original tissue, but I can't find anything about that from the Cambrian. That's not to say it doesn't exist, but if it does, it doesn't seem to be widely reported. Of course, if Tom bothered to ever give examples, I could look into this in more depth, but it's beginning to feel like perhaps he just doesn't actually have examples.
The problem is these soft tissues and structures could not survive because there are 5 major processes, 5, not 3, that break them down over time.
Okay, weird way to put it, but let's see what these 5 processes are that prevent biomolecules from being preserved in a way that keeps some of the mechanical characteristics of the original biomolecules.
When confronted with this, the evolutionists say, well, there's 3 main things that break them down over time. Number 1 is bacterial or microbial intrusion, which would eat up the soft structures and metabolize them and destroy them relatively rapidly.
I mean, they would, but the very fact that something has fossilized at all usually means that they were in an environment where bacteria are significantly impeded in digesting the organism. Usually, bacteria are more used as a potential alternative to preservation, in that they can contaminate the fossil with biomolecules, which can be mistaken for preserved original biomolecules.
But if they're sealed off from microbial intrusion, and they're sealed off from excessive oxygen and water, oxygen would break it down by oxidation and water by hydrolysis, then conceivably these structures could last for millions of years.
Especially if there is something that can strengthen the molecules to make them even more resistant to decay, such as, the presence of iron atoms, which can cause some molecules to loop around themselves, called cross-linking, which then exposes much less of the molecules to other chemicals that could break them apart and is generally a lower energy state, making the molecule less likely to spontaneously decay. Oh, and what do you know? These finds tend to be associated with iron, particularly from blood. Also, cross-linking is the same basic mechanism that makes formaldehyde work as a preservative for organic molecules. It's why museums can preserve specimens of animals essentially indefinitely, even in areas where normally decay would be fairly rapid.
Not true, because there are 2 other things that would break them down within a minimum of just a few 100,000 years.
Ooh, the 2 weird tricks paleontologists don't want you to know about.
What are those other 2 factors?
I don't know. Apparently, they're secret.
One is the second law of thermodynamics.
Jesus Christ, that's not exactly something paleontologists don't know about. But since cross-linking is in fact the thermodynamically favored condition if there's something to cross-link around, and you can tell it is since it's a spontaneous reaction and thermodynamically favored reactions and spontaneous reactions are the same thing, then they'll cross-link around it and stay that way. But hey, who cares, right? Let's just pretend that you can say, second law of thermodynamics, and it just means things turn into smaller things inevitably over any time period that's convenient, even though that's not at all what it means. The second law of thermodynamics is that entropy in an isolated system must go up over time or stay the same. It cannot go down. So what is entropy? Well, it's a bit hard to describe, but there are a couple definitions that work well from different perspectives and get you to the same place in the end. A macro-scale definition and a micro-scale definition. Let's start with a macro-scale definition. In this case, entropy is a measurement of the amount of energy in the system that is unavailable to do work in the mechanical sense. Work is just the displacement of matter. If you pick up a stone and move it, then the amount of work you did is measured in the energy it took to move that stone to the new location. And it is measured in joules, the same unit as energy. Work needs energy, obviously, and to get energy to do work, there needs to be an energy gradient. Think about a steam engine, which is the classic case in thermodynamics, and indeed the reason thermodynamics was invented in the first place. If the steam is not hotter than the air around it, you can't use it to spin anything. And so you can't really extract work from it. This also means that if a whole system lacks energy gradients, it can't do work. This ties into the microscale definition of entropy. At the scale of particle physics, entropy is a measure of how many microstates the subatomic particles in a system can take that will result in the measured macrostate. That probably sounds like a bunch of nonsense, but really it's not that hard to understand. Imagine a glass of water with a cover on it to prevent evaporation from reducing the total water in the system. You leave it on the shelf somewhere where it won't be disturbed for several days. When you go look at it, it should be calm, still, and largely unchanging. It should also have a temperature equal to the room it's in. Now, think about all the water molecules in that cup. They're bouncing around in there, and we know because they're not at absolute zero temperature. So at the scale of water molecules, that calm water is in constant motion, with trillions of particles bouncing into each other, sometimes forming weak hydrogen bonds, sometimes going up above the surface only to be replaced by another molecule in the air above the water level, etc. Each position each water molecule takes, and their momentum, all recorded, is the microstate of the water. And clearly, there are trillions upon trillions of microstates that can account for the clear, calm water. Now imagine that you measure the microstate down to the protons, neutrons, and electrons in the water. That's the kind of microstate we are concerned with entropy. It turns out that the closer a system is to thermodynamic equilibrium, that is, not having any energy gradients, the more microstates are available for the system to take that will result in that macrostate. And so the number of available microstates that will result in the measured macrostate turns out to be the same thing as the amount of energy unavailable to do work. Now, it turns out that because particle physics is a stochastic thing, it is technically possible for entropy to spontaneously decrease, but it is fantastically unlikely in any system big enough for humans to care about. So we still call the second law a law. Now, you're probably wondering what the heck that has to do with the decay of biomolecules, and other than the fact that if a lower energy state exists that a molecule could spontaneously take on, it will, and that often, but not always, that corresponds to decay, well, nothing. And since cross-linking is indeed thermodynamically favored, it turns out that the second law actually also promotes preservation in some situations. Situations where there is a chemical makeup that allows for the cross-linking. So the second law of thermodynamics can either hinder or cause decay. It is not just a one-size-fits-all everything gets worse and smaller kind of thing, even though that's how creationists often frame it.
The law that states that with time, all structures break down from complex to simple, from order to disorder.
Nope, it doesn't at all. Like, there's nothing about simplicity, complexity, or order or disorder in the concept of entropy. The amount of energy unavailable to do work in a system just does not map well onto the concepts of order or complexity.
It affects biological compounds and structures, absolutely. And it's more efficient at warmer temperatures than cold temperatures.
Efficiency doesn't make any sense in this case. Efficiency in physics is basically a measurement of the amount of energy that is lost when doing work. Think about sliding a brick. If you were to slide it across a very sticky surface, a lot of the energy you had to use to move the brick would be lost to friction. On the other hand, if you slid it down a heavily greased, slick surface, very little of the energy would be lost to friction. This means that the second scenario is more efficient in terms of the energy needed to perform the work of moving the brick. Now, at high energies, it is the case that molecules are faster to take on thermodynamically favorable configurations, which often means breaking apart. So in hot systems, entropy can increase faster than in cold systems, but that is not efficiency. In fact, speed and efficiency aren't really related in physics.
But almost all dinosaur fossils are found at the temperate zone on the Earth.
That's more because dinging at the poles or the equator kinda sucks than because that's where the dinosaurs lived. There are in fact lots of dinosaurs in Alaska and Antarctica, but I'll be damned if I'm going to freeze my tail off digging for them.
And at those temperate temperatures that they would have been subjected to, the Arrhenius equations, where they run experiments and heat these things up to a higher temperature than normal and see how much they break down thermodynamically. Then they use the equations to plot and predict at lower temperatures how fast they would be breaking down.
Hey, that's true, but you know that the sort of originator of this whole field of study, Dr. Mary Schweitzer, a former young earth creationist and currently devout evangelical Christian, did that very thing, but also tested iron cross-linking and found that iron cross-linking allowed these molecules to persist in cross-linked form basically indefinitely. So Tom kind of just debunked himself by mentioning such experiments.
Every time they've done that, they come with the conclusion that even the strongest proteins, such as collagen, which is like 3 different proteins wound together like a rope.
Well, it's triple helix, but each single helix is a collagen strand, so it's not like it's 3 different kinds of protein. But yes, it is very robust.
Very, very strong protein. Even that would break down completely in just a few 100,000 years.
Yeah, but what if it's in a preservative, like iron-laden blood or formaldehyde? Oops. Then it lasts more or less indefinitely. Granted, it won't be in completely its original configuration, but it will still be recognizably collagen. I feel like Tom here doesn't really keep up with a lot of other young Earth creationists, because they normally don't want to accept the validity of these kinds of experiments at all. Because while yes, they do show that normally these molecules are completely gone in hundreds of thousands of years, they also show that proposed preservation mechanisms for which we have evidence will allow them to last indefinitely. And they don't want that to be true. Not at all.
And that's a big, big problem when you have it largely intact and other less robust proteins largely intact within dinosaurs and other creatures, even from the Cambrian, like beardworms.
Beardworms? Well, at least that's something I can look up rather than just Cambrian. So let's see where this gets us. And the answer is nothing. I can't even find much about beardworms from the Cambrian at all. The on-screen graphic isn't from beardworms. And I know I'm not going to get much in the way of a citation from Kindell. I was really hoping for something, but not even Creationist sources showed up that I could find. If you know what he's talking about, put it in the comments, because if that's true at all, I really want to know about it. But you can't put a hyperlink, so just write the name of the paper and the publication and at least the lead author.
Where we have soft structure in proteins. Now then, so we see in this case the structure from this T-Rex. This is from Mary Schweitzer, who did some of the groundbreaking work on this.
I'd argue it was basically all her and her assistant, but also I bet Kindell ignores the fact that she's a former young Earth creationist who is really sick of creationists misrepresenting her work, and who remains a devout evangelical as far as I know, and when last I read anything from her discussing her religious affiliation.
And we can see the nucleated red blood cells still largely intact.
I can see what looks like nucleated blood cells, but are they that? We don't know. Dr. Schweitzer can't confirm that they were. I personally think it's more likely than not that they are, but that's my hunch after looking at the findings. That's not the actual findings.
Her main hypothesis was that iron released from the hemoglobin in the blood cells caused cross reactions.
Cross-linking.
Actually, cross links.
Hey, he got there! And of course, she experimentally demonstrated that this was both possible and preservative using the exact kind of experimental setup that Tom here has already mentioned.
In the proteins that made them tougher, and supposedly they were tough enough to last for millions of years. She only ran her experiment for a couple of years.
So what? She did it using the exact method that Tom accepts for simulating long periods of time, using high heat. Sorry, but that's his standard. Him not accepting this as a valid method is just him being dishonest.
And others who tried to emulate the experiment didn't get the same results. That's a big red flag in science. When you do the same experiment, you don't get the same results.
And of course he won't cite those studies, but when I looked into this, iron cross-linking was still well regarded as a mechanism in 2023. And I did not find much that was disputing it since Dr. Schweitzer's 2013 paper on it. Further, while other mechanisms that are supplementary have been suggested, all involving protein cross-linking, interestingly, there seems to be no serious doubt that iron cross-linking is an explanation for at least some preservation of Mesozoic soft tissue. Also, I want to note that he's citing MSNBC, and not, the actual paper by Schweitzer et al. I find that incredibly inappropriate and amateurish. If you're wondering, the 2013 paper about iron cross-linking is A Role for Iron and Oxygen Chemistry in Preserving Soft Tissue, Cells, and Molecules from Deep Time by Schweitzer, Zhang, Cleland, Goodwin, Boatman, Thiel, Marcus, and Fakra, published in Proceedings B of the Royal Society on January 22, 2013. See, I cited a paper, something it seems Kindell is biologically incapable of doing.
Furthermore, we have now destroyed the whole hypothesis.
Interesting. Will this be the first ever actual contribution to real science from a distinctly creationist framework? Let's find out.
Because we have found soft tissues in creatures that did not have iron from hemoglobin or from the environment. There's not iron in the tissue.
Well, as I said, there are other cross-linking mechanisms that have been recognized in the last dozen years or so, but that's not really all that surprising. But I'd love to know exactly what he's talking about.
So iron cannot be the answer.
Well, it can't be the answer, but it's still an answer. It still works, and it still explains a large portion of the molecular level soft tissue preservation that we observe. This is like discovering that one can take a plane from Boston to Chicago, and then declaring that therefore there is no way that you could take a train, except that you can, Amtrak runs trains that connect those cities.
And she's even admitted that in those cases, it simply can't be applied.
Wow, the already well-known fact that one mechanism doesn't explain all molecular fossils.
Whoa, this is worthless.
But they've all refused to even mention something they don't want you to know about.
Kindell is the most conspiracy brain motherfucker I've ever covered. This dude is at like Flurf levels of conspiracy brain. It's all secret cabals trying to keep the real science away from you, because I guess the conspirators want to go to hell or something. They certainly don't seem to want the fame and fortune that would come with overturning every field of science simultaneously at a fundamental level. That would be inconvenient or bad or something. I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me.
There's a fifth factor that would break this down within at least a few 100,000 years that cannot be avoided. Does anybody know what it is?
I hate when speakers ask questions like that. If you're giving a lecture, you're the one who is supposed to know things and tell people the things you know. So just tell them. Unless it's a smallish classroom setting, these kinds of questions are never answered and they are just annoying time wasters. Really? Alpha particles? Unless they're in the bones, that's not going to be much of a problem. You can shield from even high levels of alpha flux with like a sheet of paper. They won't even get through your skin. The mean free path, or how long an average alpha particle will travel before bumping into something in granite and other similarly dense rock, is measured in micrometers. And you know how I know? Because that's what makes the polonium halos in granite that creationists are so enamored with. There just is no way that alpha particles that are not internal to the fossil are going to be a very big deal inside the fossil. Now, some fossils are indeed quite radioactive, but as far as I can tell, that's not the case for the fossils with this soft tissue preservation. Which makes sense, since if they were radioactive, we probably wouldn't find molecular fossils. And how is this being kept a secret? It's not like the existence of one of the most common kinds of radiation from nuclear decay is a secret. Alpha particles are just basically bare helium nuclei with a quartet of nucleons, with 2 protons and 2 neutrons. That mass and charge tells you why they are so easy to stop. Being charged, they are deflected or attracted by charges at a subatomic level, and being relatively massive themselves, they tend to hit nuclei fairly regularly.
Well, it's bombardment by alpha particles by decay of radioactive elements in sedimentary rocks, such as uranium and thorium. The sedimentary rocks are primarily eroded from igneous rocks, lava rocks.
That's true.
Which often contain particles of uranium and thorium, which give off alpha decay, alpha particles, which are higher energy.
But have much, much, much smaller mean free paths than, say, beta particles or gamma particles.
Can actually penetrate partway through rocks.
Yeah, like 40 microns in. That's technically part way, I suppose.
And because of the bones tend to absorb these into them, they get this bombardment directly from close proximity within the bones. And all of the data indicates it would completely destroy any soft tissue, cell structure, proteins completely within a few 100,000 years.
All of what data? I can't find anything about this, which is becoming a theme. Is Kindell just making this stuff up? It seems like he has this as his own pet hypothesis, but isn't bothering to test it. You know, most alpha emitters that could have entered a fossil within the past 6,000 years of a young Earth timeline would still be there. He could just test to see if fossils actually have significant alpha flux in their interior. It's not like there aren't actual Mesozoic fossils in creationist collections, and it's also not like a probe that can detect alpha particles is some new thing. Drill into a fossil bone, like the ones that normally contain soft tissue, or even better, one that's known to, and check the alpha flux. I bet it will be very low in most cases. And in cases where it's not, like many radioactive fossils, that fossil won't contain molecular fossils derived from proteins. Plus, you could do a different experiment where you actually have a known alpha source and hold it up to the fossil and then put the probe in and see if then the alpha flux goes up. If he did any of this, he could just show us the data instead of doing what seems an awful lot like pretending that there are data that seem not to exist.
This is such an inexorable problem, something for which they have not even a theoretical answer.
Or even as far as can be seen, an awareness that this is a problem at all. In fact, it seems that even other creationists besides Kindell don't know about this. This alleged problem isn't showing up even on creationist websites. It really seems like this is just Tom's little pet gotcha bullshit he made up, and no one but he takes it seriously. That's kind of cute in a pathetic sort of way.
But they often don't like to mention it at all, hoping people don't know about it. If you do mention it, they do admit grudgingly, well, yes, it's a problem. But when we ask them what's the obvious solution, they don't have any.
I don't think this is a conversation that happened. First, I very much doubt that Kindell is in correspondence with any actual scientists. I mean, what would they talk about? He'd just say all manner of stuff so stupid it sounds like it came from a potato infected with blight that smoked too much meth, and then the scientist's brain would leak out of their ears in protest, since most of them aren't as inured to this kind of brain rot content as I am. Second, it's not like there wasn't pushback against Schweitzer's finds inside the scientific community. They came up with basically every reason possible to say that it wasn't actually intrinsic to the bone, and yet even within that context, I can't find anything about alpha particles.
So again, censorship.
Call me crazy, but I don't think we need to posit intentional censorship to explain that an idea seemingly made up by some guy no one has heard of, who says stuff on par with that paragon of intellect Eric Dubé, or perhaps Mark Sargent, is not really talked about widely. It's kind of like how there aren't really a lot of architects or civil engineers actually addressing the ravings of Mudflutters, or Roger from Mud Fossil U. But hey, maybe there really is a secret society silencing Kindell in particular. That seems absolutely insane, but hey, Tom seems a bit loopy, so maybe that checks out. Also, really, call me crazy in the comments, it helps feed the algorithm. Just don't mention the algorithm in your comments. It can read them, and it knows when you say something like, commenting to feed the algorithm, and it won't count those comments.
It's kept a lot of people from realizing that the iron hypothesis has been disproven by finding of the soft tissue without any iron.
That's not even how basic logic works. That's like saying that you've disproved roast beef sandwiches by discovering that corned beef sandwiches exist. That's just not how anything works. All that means is that iron isn't a one-size-fits-all hypothesis, which is acknowledged in the literature now. Just like sometimes you want to change it up and swap from a roast beef sandwich with horseradish mayo, lettuce, and cheese, and instead reach for a Reuben. The weird thing is that I'm not even hungry right now as I write this.
And nobody has even a theoretical explanation as to how these could survive alpha particle bombardment by ground radiation for anything more than a few 100,000 years.
Yeah, but also no one has an explanation for how they could have survived bombardment by neutron radiation. Probably because there is no reason to, since there's no reason to suspect high neutron flux in these fossils where the tissue remnants are found. And so far, I can't find anything suggesting a high alpha flux in these either, so it seems like a non-issue. Of course, once again, creationists are welcome to just do the work to find evidence of high alpha flux in these fossils. It's just that they seem not to have done it, and possibly because most of them aren't Thomas Kindell, the only person I've ever heard mention this.
So this appears to be extremely powerful evidence that in as good a shape as these soft tissues, cell structures, and proteins are,
which is to say, actually not very good at the molecular level. While they often retain the approximate shape and color of the original tissue, at the molecular level they are severely degraded. The heme molecules that give the reddish color to the blood have been reduced to much smaller porphyrin molecules which retain the color, but are certainly not the highly complex proteins from which they are derived. Similarly, the collagen that has been found is cross-linked, which is itself a change, but also broken up into smaller subunits than the original collagen would have been broken into. These are not intact molecules that are being found, not by a long shot.
They can be no more than just several thousand years old.
You know, earlier he was saying several hundreds of thousands of years old.
Agreeing powerfully with what the Bible teaches, that no more than about 5,000 years ago they were buried, living at the same time, buried by the great Genesis flood.
There it is. He has to lie about even what he himself said, because hundreds of thousands of years is still too much too old for his mythology. Nothing says this is all made up to soothe his cognitive dissonance, like changing the numbers within this very talk that he himself gave, just to provide aid and comfort to his dogmas. Could it be any more obvious that this is all just intellectually dishonest and not concerned in the least with what's actually true?
And that's why they're still intact. They simply haven't been around or in the ground long enough to completely deteriorate as they should have if they're millions of years old.
It's just too bad none of that actually checks out when there's something to check out, and that some of it seems to just be made up. Not so much on the spot, but perhaps while preparing the slides for this. Really, I'm pretty sure he just made up the alpha particle thing.
Now, I quote here the evolutionists Collins and Buckley.
Interestingly, this quotation is from before Schweitzer's 2013 cross-linking paper, so they cannot have taken into account one of the primary preservation mechanisms. I wonder if Kindell has checked the timeline on this.
Who have done a lot of research and published a lot of peer-reviewed research on how long it takes for proteins, and especially really tough protein like collagen, to break down.
Too bad we didn't get anything from them from after the 2013 study. I wonder if it's because after that they accepted the studies showing that there were preservation mechanisms that they had not before explored.
And they did this originally in relation to archaeological sites in Great Britain. Yeah, they're both British scientists. And of course, archaeological sites are considered to be during the time of man and no more than several thousand years old.
Well, some of them are actually tens of thousands of years old, although at that point, the line between archaeology and paleoanthropology can get a bit blurry.
Therefore, finding proteins and collagen, things like that, intact, largely intact, was not a problem.
It also, of course, means that most of what they're doing isn't really all that similar to the environments in which pristine fossils are found, since that tends to be places like anoxic lagoons and bogs, places where humans tend not to put cemeteries. But hey, who cares about depositional environment? And yeah, under most circumstances, I'm sure that tens of thousands of years is enough to degrade things like collagen. There's a reason the vast majority of fossils have no molecular soft tissue preservation.
Because even thermodynamics and ground radiation would not have broken them down that much in just a few thousand years. So they published all this data where they showed that with the experiments, with the Arrhenius equations, plotting it out, they said it would take between 0.2 and 0.7 million years. In other words, 200,000 to 700,000 years.
Look at that, a creationist getting math right instead of being 5 to 7 orders of magnitude off. That's neat. But also, let's read what the optimal environment that was used was. This is from the paper he cited. Quote, to simulate the thermal degradation of type 1 collagen, samples of modern cattle, Bos taurus, and human, Homo sapiens bone pieces were heated in sealed Pyrex glass vials under wet conditions, 10 milliliter distilled water, 1 gram bone, at 90 degrees Celsius, for a maximum duration of 32 days. 7 subsamples, including 5 milliliters of the supernatant, were taken after 1, 2, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 26, and 32 days of incubation. After heating, the vials were cooled, decanted, and lyophilized for subsequent amino acid analysis steps. So, no iron or other potential preservative. Of course, this does not actually account for any of the circumstances proposed to preserve these tissues. Should we really be surprised that a paper published before the first paper proposing a preservation mechanism, and which did not include any preservatives, resulted in a decay rate for collagen that's much faster than we would see in, say, a T-Rex femur from which Dr. Schweitzer collected collagen remnants? And further, let's remember that technically, no collagen has ever been found in a Mesozoic dinosaur skeleton. Instead, what is found are broken down collagen remnants, cross-linked collagen-derived molecules. So even if this were applicable, since we aren't finding actual collagen in the first place, technically this wouldn't even be a contradiction.
Average of 450,000 years at 10 degrees Celsius, which is only about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, where levels of collagen default to just 1% in an optimum burial environment.
Well, I guess now we know that despite citing this paper, Kindell didn't seem to read it, since in fact the tests were done in water. Oops. Now I'm going to be fair, I didn't read the whole thing either, I just read the first page and the whole methods section. But all I wanted was the methods, and just that was enough to know what they tested. Kindell didn't even get that part right.
Now, optimum means no microbes eating it up, no excess of oxygen or water. So even in the optimum environment, it's going to break down by thermodynamics at these relatively cool temperatures in just several 100,000 years.
Yeah, in the absence of any preservative method. That's true. Good thing we have methods to preserve the molecules, and of course they broke down anyway. Just not so much as to be unrecognizable.
More recent experiments done with the F-tier microscopy devices.
Weird then how they're called F-tier. What do S-tier microscopes do?
Which are much more sophisticated and can measure much more accurately than the devices used by Collins and Buckley years ago, indicates it's breaking down actually about twice as fast as what they measured.
You know, that's weird, because this kind of measurement isn't done by microscope at all, normally. In fact, in the paper itself, the measurements were taken by matrix-assisted laser desorption ionization time-of-flight mass spectrometry, or MALDI-TOFMS, in reflection mode. That's not a microscope. I reiterate my belief that Kindell did not actually read this paper. I suspect he found the quotation in the work of some other, more popular creationist, and simply stole the quote without ever checking the paper. Seems pretty shady. But also, if a microscope shows that these are breaking down twice as fast, then why did the spectrometry from Buckley and Collins detect higher rates of preservation? Mass spectrometry is a far more sophisticated and accurate way to measure small amounts of chemicals such as proteins than a microscope could ever be. I doubt the experiments he's talking about even exist, but I would expect them to be far less sensitive and accurate even if they did. Microscopes just aren't how you look for traces of chemicals.
So you can reduce that down to about 225,000 years. Even for tough proteins like collagen, and the less tough ones, which are almost all the rest of them, would last even much less than that. Powerful, powerful evidence.
So far, the entirety of his evidence has been a paper from before the paper that actually gave one of the current explanations that didn't test anything relevant. That's not what I would call powerful.
That the Bible is true, that all those creatures' remains are only thousands of years old, and simply this evidence should not exist if it's anywhere near as old as what they claim.
Wow. It's amazing what creationists will accept as evidence that their interpretation of the Bible is true. Literal made-up bullshit and lies about papers. It's almost like they're desperate because their beliefs are very obviously false and shouldn't be taken seriously. But they don't like that. Anyway, after this he's going to talk about alleged finds of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones, but that's something we can safely leave for next time. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, then please hit like on this video and tell me what you liked in the comments. If you didn't like it, then hit dislike, and let me know what the problem was. Either way, please subscribe if you haven't, and turn on all notifications so that occasionally YouTube might tell you about my content if they feel like it, regardless of your wishes. I'm the Dapper Dinosaur. Hey, before you leave, I just want to take a second to thank my patrons and channel members, especially those pledging $20 or above. Van Tovind, Philgevara, Tapioca Weasel, Whispers, Max Cherry, North Texas Fossils, John Ackerman, Elleron Teller, Ian Chen, Kelvin Brostek von Mennen, Landon Knoll, Mabbity Babbity, Sphincter of Doom, and Volus. It's because of my channel members and patrons whom you're seeing on screen that this channel can stay afloat. Without you, it would all shut down. If you want to join the team, there's a link to join the channel below this video, and there's a link to join the Patreon in the description. On the Patreon, you can get a 10% discount for pledging annually, and either way, you get early access to virtually all of my scripted videos, often 3 to 5 months before they come out for the general public. Thanks for watching.